She stood on the porch with a shotgun and a lie, 5 feet 3 inches of fury against 3 armed men on horseback. Behind her, the man she loved was bleeding on the cabin floor. And the only thing between his life and his death was a woman the whole world had called worthless. This is the story of how the unwanted daughter became the queen of the mountain. They packed her trunk with moth-eaten wool and a Bible telling her she was going to men who needed a servant, not a wife. The letter had said they needed a woman of sturdy constitution. It had not said they lived on a mountain no wagon could reach. It had not said they hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 years. And it sure as hell hadn't said they would be the most terrifying and the most gentle men she would ever meet. But that comes later. First there was the parlor and the lie. Before we go deeper into this story, if you're new here, I want you to hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every single week, and the folks who listen tell me these tales stay with them for days. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. I'd love to know. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The Whitfield Mansion on Lindell Boulevard was one of the finest addresses in St. Louis, Missouri. It was a monument to Theodore Whitfield's ambition. Italian marble floors, crystal chandeliers imported from Paris, walls lined with oil paintings of ancestors that Theodore had purchased at auction because he didn't have any real ones worth displaying. Every surface, every drape, every silver candlestick in that house was designed to project an image of old money, even though the Whitfield fortune was barely 15 years old, built on railroad contracts, government land grants, and the kind of deals that happen in back rooms over whiskey and handshakes that no honest man would shake. On the evening of October 23rd, 1878, Clara Whitfield stood in the corner of the parlor, half hidden behind a potted fern, watching her 3 stepsisters prepare for the Haversham Autumn Ball. She was 24 years old. She was beautiful in a way that made the room feel wrong. Cornflower blue eyes, too vivid. Honey blonde hair, too luminous. Features too refined for a girl who was supposed to be invisible. She wore a dress that had been fashionable 3 seasons ago, re-hemmed by her own hand, the seams let out to accommodate a figure that had grown since the dress was purchased for her stepsister Margaret, who had since declared it tired. Her stepsisters fluttered around the room like exotic birds. Margaret, Eleanor, and Fay, their dresses new, their hair styled by the French maid, their laughter high and careless. Lucille, their mother, and Clara's stepmother orbited them like a planet, with 3 moons adjusting a ribbon here, smoothing a curl there, radiating a warmth that had never, not once in 16 years, been directed at Clara. Clara knew she was beautiful. She had known it since she was 14, when she caught the stable boy staring at her with an expression that was equal parts wonder and terror. She had known it every time a man at one of Theodore's dinner parties looked at her a moment too long, then looked away when Lucille cleared her throat. But beauty, Clara had learned, was not the same as value. In this house, value was measured in bloodline, and Clara's blood was wrong. Her mother, Lenore, had been a seamstress. Not a tragic seamstress from a novel, not a fallen gentlewoman or a secret heiress. She had been a real seamstress, a woman who mended shirts for pennies, who smelled of starch and cotton, who loved Theodore Whitfield with a devotion he never deserved. Lenore died of consumption when Clara was 6 years old, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that Clara washed in the kitchen basin because the servants had already been dismissed to save money. Clara remembered her mother's hands, red and rough, always moving, always mending. She remembered the lullabies sung in a voice that was already fraying at the edges. She remembered the last thing Lenore said to her, sitting propped against thin pillows in a room that smelled of camphor and dying. "You are stronger than you know, my love. Don't let them tell you otherwise." They had been telling her otherwise ever since. Theodore remarried 8 months after Lenore's death. Lucille Davenport brought 3 daughters, impeccable pedigree, and a permanent expression of faint disgust whenever Clara entered a room. To the Whitfields, Clara was not a daughter. She was a stain. The living reminder of Theodore's youthful mistake, his marriage to a woman beneath his station. And Clara, hidden behind the fern, watching her stepsisters leave for a ball she was not invited to attend, understood this with the clarity of someone who has spent 24 years studying the architecture of her own erasure. The summons came that evening after the ball, after the champagne, after the house had settled into its usual silence. Clara was in the kitchen reading. Not poetry, not a novel, a book on hydraulic engineering stolen from Theodore's study 2 years prior. He never noticed. He never noticed anything Clara did which was precisely why she had survived this long. The precision of the diagrams calmed her mind. The ordered world of leverage and pressure and flow was the antidote to the chaos of being unwanted. If the equations balanced, if the forces aligned, then there was order in the universe, even if there was none in this house. A servant appeared at the door. "Your father wishes to see you in his study immediately." Clara set down her book, smoothed her dress, walked through the marble halls with the careful, measured steps of a woman who had learned that every movement in this house was observed and judged. She paused outside the study door. The air smelled of cigar smoke and something sharper, the metallic tang of a decision already made. Theodore's study was a room designed to intimidate. The desk was the size of a small boat. The bookshelves contained leather-bound volumes that Theodore had never read, but that looked impressive to visitors. Behind the desk sat Theodore Whitfield himself, 57 years old, silver-haired, cold blue eyes that Clara had inherited, but that looked different in his face, harder, like chips of ice in a drink that had already gone flat. Lucille was there too, standing by the window, her handkerchief pressed to her nose, as if Clara's presence had introduced a foul odor into the room. "We have found a match for you, Clara," Theodore said, not looking up from his ledger. Clara's heart did not leap. It sank, like a stone dropped in still water. She had heard these words before, twice. The first time she was 18, and the match was a 40-year-old widower with gout and a reputation for cruelty. Clara refused. Theodore locked her in her room for a week. The second time she was 20, and the match was a business associate of Theodore's, a man who looked at Clara the way a butcher looks at a hanging carcass. Clara refused again. Theodore stopped speaking to her entirely for 3 months. "A match father," Clara said. Her voice was careful. "Who would have make a family named Calloway, 3 brothers." Theodore shuffled a piece of paper, cheap parchment stained and creased clearly, written by a hand unused to correspondence. "They live in the Wyoming Territory near the Teton Range. Trappers, mountain men. They wrote to the Western Matrimonial Agency asking for a woman of sturdy constitution to help manage their homestead." "Sturdy constitution," Clara repeated. The words tasted like ash. "They didn't ask for a society girl," Theodore continued. A thin smile played on his lips, the smile of a man disposing of an inconvenience. "They asked for someone useful, someone who could work. I sent them your daguerreotype, the one where you aren't smiling." The eldest wrote back. He said you looked capable. Theodore set down his pen and finally looked at her. "Capable. Can you imagine we are sending you west, Clara? It is time you earned your keep." Clara felt the sting of tears but refused to let them fall. This was a skill she had perfected over 24 years, the art of weeping without witnesses. "You are sending me to the wilderness, alone, to strangers." "You are strong, aren't you?" Lucille chimed in, stepping forward with an expression of false concern so practiced it might have been painted on. "You've always been so durable. The city isn't for you, Clara. You frighten the suitors." She paused, then delivered the killing blow with the precision of a surgeon. "Out there with the animals and the savages, you might actually fit in." Another pause. "Besides, the ticket is bought, one way." The cruelty was not just in the exile. It was in the casualness of it. The way Theodore returned to his ledger before Clara had even left the room, as if the matter of his daughter's banishment carried the same weight as a shipping invoice. The way Lucille smoothed her skirt and walked out without looking back, as if Clara had already ceased to exist. That night, Clara packed her trunk. She took the few things that were truly hers, the books she had collected, the sturdy woolen coats her stepsisters had discarded, a tintype photograph of her mother that she had hidden in the lining of her Bible for 16 years, safe from Lucille's periodic purges of anything that reminded the household that Lenore had ever existed. Margaret came to watch. She leaned in the doorway with a glass of champagne and a smile that wasn't kind. Margaret was the eldest stepsister, the prettiest, the cruelest. She had her mother's instinct for finding the softest place to press the knife. "Do you know what Father told them?" Margaret asked. Her voice was silky with malice. "He told them and you were prone to hysteria, that you have fits, that you're mentally unfit for society. He said you're being sent for your own health." Clara's hands froze over her Bible. That isn't true. Of course it isn't. But what does truth matter when you have a telegraph and a lawyer? Margaret sipped her champagne. He also promised them a dowry of $500, which he has no intention of paying. And he included a clause in the contract, something about a competency review. If the marriage fails, the Callaways forfeit their land rights to father as compensation. She smiled. You're not being married off Clara. You're being used as a legal weapon. Clara turned to her stepsister. For a moment, something fierce and dangerous flickered in her cornflower eyes. Something Margaret had never seen before because Clara had never let anyone see it. Why are you telling me this? Margaret shrugged, but her smile wavered. Because I think it's funny, and because I don't think you'll survive long enough for it to matter. After Margaret left, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her nursery, the room she was given as a child and never moved out of because Lucille insisted that the guest rooms needed to be available, and the nursery was perfectly adequate for Clara's needs. She saw her mother's face in her own, the same blue eyes, the same delicate jaw, the same quiet determination that Lenore carried like a shield against a world that never valued her. Clara stood up. She walked to Theodore's study. The door was unlocked. Theodore was at his club, celebrating the disposal of his unwanted daughter. Clara entered. She went to the second drawer of his desk, the one with the lock she had picked when she was 14, because she was curious and because no one ever expects the invisible girl to be dangerous. Inside the drawer was a leather-bound ledger, not the business ledger that sat on his desk. The other one, the one he didn't show the accountants. Clara had known about this book for 8 years. She had read it 3 times, cataloging the bribes, the fraud, the corner cutting that killed 3 workers on the Platte River Bridge in 1873, the swindled land grants to shell companies. She had never planned to use it. She had hoped she would never need to. She took it. She returned to her room. She hid the ledger at the bottom of her trunk beneath the Bible and the wool. She closed the lid. I will not die out there, she whispered to the empty room, and I will never come back. The train journey was 7 days of soot noise and transformation. Clara watched through the window as the green rolling hills of Missouri flattened into the gray immensity of the Great Plains. The landscape was a metaphor for her life, the cultivated world falling away, replaced by something raw and limitless and terrifyingly empty. She rode in the cheapest car. Theodore's generosity did not extend to comfort. The wooden bench was hard, the air thick with coal smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. She shared the car with immigrants, homesteaders, and a group of weathered cowboys who tipped their hats at her but kept their distance, recognizing in her the particular brand of determination that marks a woman traveling alone. During the journey, Clara read. She read her engineering manual. She read a medical text she had taken from the Whitfield Library, a treatise on frontier medicine, wound care, and the treatment of fever. She read not for pleasure but for survival. She was going to a place where knowledge was the difference between living and dying, and Clara had always believed that knowledge was the one inheritance her father could not take from her. By the time the locomotive screeched into the dusty, lawless station of Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, Clara Whitfield was different. Not transformed. Not yet. But changed. The silk and lace girl who stood behind the fern in the Whitfield parlor was still inside her, but she was wrapped in wool now, and her blue eyes had a new edge. From Cheyenne, a stagecoach carried her to the town of Jackson's Crossing, a rough settlement of 2 saloons, a general store, a telegraph office, and a church that looked like it was built by someone who had heard of churches but never actually seen one. From Jackson's Crossing, a mule cart carried her into the mountains driven by old Walt, a toothless, tobacco-chewing character who regarded Clara with the weary suspicion of a man who had seen too many greenhorns come west, full of hope, and leave in coffins. You heading up to Callaway Ridge, Walt spat tobacco juice into the snow. The air was thin here, cold enough to freeze breath in the lungs. The trees had closed in dense stands of pine and spruce that blocked the skimo. I am, Clara said. I'm to be the wife of the eldest. Walt laughed, a wheezing, phlegmy sound. Wife, huh? 3 brothers up on that ridge. Biggest men you ever saw. Haven't had a visitor in 5 years. They say the eldest killed a grizzly with his bare hands. He spat again. They also say he ate the man who tried to jump his claim. Clara pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. Is any of that true? Probably not. But he is the biggest human being I ever looked at, and I fought alongside a man named Ox McCready in the war, and Ox was 6'4". Walt flicked the reins. Good luck, miss. Hope you're tougher than you look. The wind up there don't like strangers, and neither do the Callaways. The mule cart climbed higher. The silence of the mountains was immense, a physical weight that pressed against Clara's ears. She had never experienced silence like this. In St. Louis, there was always noise. Carriages' voices, the clatter of industry. Here the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. The Callaway homestead was not the shack Clara expected. It was a fortress. Hand-hewn logs of Douglas fir, each nearly a foot thick, mortised and joined with the skill of a master carpenter. The cabin was nestled into the crook of a granite cliff protected from the howling wind by a natural wall of ancient pines. There was a large main cabin, a smaller bunkhouse, a livestock shed, and a workshop. Smoke curled from the main cabin's stone chimney. The windows were real glass, not oiled hide, like many frontier cabins. The roof was thick with moss and natural insulation. The fireplace hearth was gray granite rising to chest height. The scene was isolated, terrifying, and unexpectedly beautiful. Old Walt dropped Clara's trunk in the snow, tipped his hat, and whipped the mules around with the urgency of a man eager to be elsewhere before nightfall. They should be inside, he called over his shoulder, or checking the trap lines. Just go on in. Doors never locked. Nothing up here to steal from, and nothing up here dumb enough to trip. Clara stood alone. The cold bit through her boots. The sun was already dipping behind the peaks, casting the valley in shades of blue and violet that she had never seen in any painting in Theodore's parlor. She dragged her trunk to the heavy wooden door, knocked. No answer. She pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of pine resin, cured leather, and wood smoke. The cabin was shockingly clean. Not the squalor she had been warned about. The floorboards were swept. The cast iron stove radiated steady heat. The furniture was rough but solid, handmade with evident skill. Thick, luxurious furs were draped over chairs and piled on the large bed in the corner. But what caught Clara's eye was the mantel above the fireplace. Arranged on the rough-hewn shelf was a collection of small, delicate wood carvings. A bird in flight, a fox curled in sleep, a bear rearing on its hind legs, a mountain cat frozen mid-leap. Each one was carved with the precision and tenderness of an artist. In a room full of roughness and survival, these carvings were a whisper of something gentler. Clara reached out to touch the bird. The front door crashed open behind her. She spun around. The first thing she saw was size. The man filling the doorway had to duck to enter his own home. He was covered in layers of buckskin and fur, his face hidden behind a thick, dark beard frosted with ice. A jagged scar ran from his temple and disappeared into the beard. A rifle was slung over one shoulder, and a brace of dead rabbits hung from his belt. He looked more mountain than man. Behind him, two more figures crowded the doorway, equally massive, equally frosted with cold. Three giants blocking out the last of the daylight. The eldest stopped. His amber eyes locked onto Clara's through the gloom. He did not speak. He just stared, his chest rising and falling from the climb, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart hammered. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The wilderness was behind them, and the mountain was above them, and she was here in this cabin in this moment. And she would be the person she had promised herself she would be. I am Clara, she said. Her voice was small in the room, but it did not waver. Clara Whitfield. The agency sent me. The eldest man remained motionless. Then slowly he unslung his rifle and leaned it against the wall. He pulled off his fur gloves, revealing hands that were scarred and massive, rough as tree bark. He walked toward her. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Clara forced herself not to step back. He stopped a foot away. He smelled of cold air and pine and something wild. He reached out a hand, and Clara closed her eyes, bracing herself for a blow, or a shove, or the cruel remarks she had been trained to expect. Her father's voice echoed in her head, the seamstress's brat. But he reached past her, gently closed the door she had left open, shutting out the wind and the cold. Then he turned back. I know who you are. His voice was a deep rumble like thunder rolling in a distant canyon. Not angry, not warm, just unused. The voice of a man who had not had reason to speak more than a dozen words a day for a decade. Your father wrote us a letter. He said you were prone to fits, that you were unstable, that sending you here was an act of mercy. Clara's stomach dropped. He told you I was mad. He told us you were mad, the man confirmed. He also said you were coming as a housekeeper, not a bride. He paused, his amber eyes searching hers. He said a lot of things. None of them explain why a woman who looks like you is standing in my cabin in the middle of nowhere. The youngest brother stepped forward. He was the tallest of the three, 6'7" at least, but he moved with a surprising gentleness, as if aware that his size could be frightening. He had warm brown eyes, sandy blonde hair that fell across his forehead in an unruly wave, and a smile that could melt a glacier. She's not a housekeeper, Eli. His voice was lighter, touched with wonder. She's real. You're actually real. He extended a hand the size of a dinner plate. I'm Levi Calloway, and you are welcome here. The middle brother hung back. Sharp-featured, hazel-eyed, his hair tied back with a leather cord, a thin scar running from his ear to his jaw. He crossed his arms and studied Clara the way a card player studies an opponent. Jonah, he said, offering nothing more than his name. Eli walked to the stove and poured coffee from a blackened pot into a tin cup. He turned back, studying Clara, her dusty traveling dress, her delicate hands, her blue eyes that were too bright and too fierce for the body they belonged to. He handed her the cup. Their fingers brushed. Clara felt the roughness of his skin, the warmth beneath it. Your father, Eli said slowly, each word measured, wrote us a letter. He said you were prone to hysteria. He said you were mentally unfit. He said sending you here was for your own health. He paused. Those were his words. Now I want to hear yours. Clara set her jaw. The old version of her, the girl behind the fern, would have crumbled. But that girl had been left somewhere between Missouri and the Rocky Mountains, and the woman who stood in this cabin was her mother's daughter. And her mother never crumbled. Lenore answered hard truths with harder truths. My father is a liar, Clara said, meeting Eli's gaze without flinching. I am not mad. I am not prone to fits. I am the daughter of his first wife, a seamstress named Lenore, and he has spent 24 years trying to make me disappear. Sending me here is not mercy, it is disposal. She took a breath. But I am here now, and I am not going back. So if you need a housekeeper, I can learn. If you need a wife, she faltered, then steadied. I can learn that too. The cabin was silent. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines. Levi broke the silence first. Eli, she stays. Jonah uncrossed his arms. His expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex, something that might have been respect. She stays, he agreed, but she sleeps in the bunkhouse. We're not animals. Eli looked at Clara. Something moved behind his amber eyes. A calculation, a memory. The recognition of something he thought he had lost long ago. There's a cot in the bunkhouse. Levi will bring you blankets. Supper's at sundown. He turned away, then paused. Can you skin a rabbit? No, Clara said, setting her jaw, but I can learn. The corner of Eli's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Good, because winter is coming, Clara, and up here it doesn't forgive. The first month on Calloway Ridge was a war of attrition between the woman Clara had been and the woman the mountain demanded she become. Each brother taught her differently. Eli taught through demonstration. He did not explain. He did, and he expected her to watch and replicate. He chopped a log and then handed her the axe. He showed her how to place the blade at the weakest point in the grain, how to lift with her shoulders and not her arms, how to let gravity and the weight of the steel do the work instead of fighting against both. He skinned a rabbit in 45 seconds and pushed the next one across the table to her. His patience was immense, but it was the patience of a mountain, immovable, silent, eternal. He did not praise her successes or criticize her failures. He simply watched with those amber eyes and waited. Levi taught through encouragement. He narrated everything he did. Look how I hold the knife at this angle that keeps the blade from catching the membrane. And he celebrated every small victory. When Clara successfully set her first trap, a steel spring number 4 designed for beaver, Levi whooped like a boy at a county fair. He introduced her to the chickens by name. This is Duchess, that's General. And the red one that pecks at my boots is called Trouble. He introduced her to the milk cow, whose name was Patience, and swore that she gave better milk when someone sang to her during milking. When Clara fell face first into a snowdrift, trying to carry the water buckets, Levi pulled her out laughing, and Clara found herself laughing too, for the first time in months. Not the polite, measured laughter of the Whitfield parlor. Real laughter. From the belly, from the chest, from somewhere deeper than she knew existed. Eli heard the laughter from inside the cabin. He came to the window. He watched Clara soaking wet and ridiculous laughing in the snow with Levi beside her. And on Eli's face, the face of a man who had forgotten how to laugh, a small smile appeared. Just for a moment. But Clara caught it. That was the moment she knew. Not with her head, but with her heart. That she was falling into something deeper than an arrangement. More dangerous than any blizzard. Jonah taught through challenge. He did not coddle. He assigned tasks that pushed her limits, then watched to see how she handled failure. He sent her to fix a broken fence post, knowing she had never held a hammer, and observed from the workshop window as she figured it out. Tried one approach, failed. Tried another, failed again. Sat in the snow and thought. Then stood up with a new plan that worked. When she returned, he said only, "You think before you act. Good. Most people don't." The physical transformation was gradual but relentless. Clara's soft hands developed calluses. Her arms showed the lean definition of someone who carries water, chops wood, and hauls supplies every day. Her pale complexion deepened to a honeyed tan. The navy blue traveling dress was retired within the first week, replaced by one of Levi's enormous flannel shirts and a pair of canvas trousers that Eli produced from a trunk without comment. Every day on Callaway Ridge began before dawn. Fire first. Eli had taught her how to stack the wood. Tinder on the bottom pine to catch fast oak on top to burn slow and hot. On the mountain in winter, fire was not a luxury. It was life itself. Breakfast was always the same. Cornbread baked on the cast iron stove, salted venison, and black coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Coffee was the last luxury the Callaway brothers refused to surrender. Levi said, "I can live without salt, but I can't live without coffee." Clara noticed that Eli always poured her cup first, though he never acknowledged it. After breakfast, the work divided. Eli checked the trap lines, a 3-hour trek through knee-deep snow. Jonah worked the skinning shed, scraping hides with a curved blade, stretching them on wooden frames, soaking them in tannin solution made from oak bark. Levi tended the livestock and maintained the cabin. Clara rotated among the brothers. First week with Levi learning the animals. Second week with Eli learning to read tracks in the snow. The difference between deer and bear and wolf. The difference between fresh sign and old, which could mean the difference between eating and being eaten. Third week with Jonah learning to scrape hides with the patience that Clara compared to fixing clocks. On the 12th day, the water pump in the horse shed broke. The crank arms snapped clean off. Jonah examined it and declared they needed to ride to Jackson's Crossing for replacement parts. 3 days round trip. In the meantime, water would have to be hauled by hand from the creek a mile through the snow. Clara said nothing. The next morning, while the three brothers were out checking the trap lines, she opened Jonah's workshop. She found an iron bar, a piece of oak, and strips of leather. Using the principles of leverage from her engineering textbook, she fabricated a replacement crank arm. It was not pretty, it was not perfect, but it worked. When the brothers returned that evening, the pump was running. Eli looked at the pump, looked at Clara, looked back at the pump. He said nothing. But that night, for the first time, he invited her to sit at the table with them for supper, instead of leaving a plate outside the bunkhouse door. Jonah inspected the replacement crank 3 times, tested the joints, nodded once. And from that day forward, he left his tools on the workshop bench instead of locking them in his trunk. An unspoken invitation for Clara to use whatever she needed, whenever she needed it. This was the moment the Callaway brothers stopped seeing Clara Whitfield as a guest, or a problem, or a curiosity. This was the moment she became something else entirely, someone who belonged. 3 weeks after her arrival, on an evening when the sunset had set the mountains on fair gold and crimson light, pouring through the gaps between the peaks, Clara was sitting on the bunkhouse porch mending a tear in Eli's coat. The work was quiet, the kind of quiet she had grown to love. Not the oppressive silence of the Whitfield mansion, where silence meant someone was waiting to criticize. This silence was different. It was the silence of a world that had no interest in judging her. Eli walked past, heading for the cabin. He stopped. "Your father's letter," he said, his back to her. "He didn't just say you were mad." Clara's needle stopped. "What else did he say?" Eli turned. The sunset painted half his face in gold and left the other half in shadow. He looked like something carved from the mountain itself. "He said your mother was a seamstress." He said it like it was a disease. Clara's throat tightened. It wasn't a disease. She was the kindest person I've ever known. Eli held her gaze. Something shifted in his expression. The wall cracked. Just a fraction. Just enough to let light through. "My wife was kind too. Catherine. She played the piano. She collected porcelain figurines." He paused. The unused voice cracked on the name. 10 years of buried grief surfacing in a single word. "She died because I brought her to a world she wasn't made for. I loved her, but I watched her wilt. Every day a little less light in her eyes. I was a lawyer in Philadelphia before I came here. Can you imagine that? A lawyer. I wore a suit. I argued cases. I had ambitions." He said the word like it tasted bitter. "I dragged Catherine from her comfortable family home to a mining town in Colorado because I wanted to build something real. She tried. God help her, she tried. But the altitude made her sick. The isolation broke her heart. And the pregnancy came too early. We lost them both, her and the baby, in the same hour." The fire crackled inside the cabin. The wind moved through the pines. "When Catherine died, I burned up my law books. Came here. Built this place with my own hands. A year later, our parents died in a house fire back in Pennsylvania. Jonah followed me west right away. Levi stayed east 3 more years working farms in Ohio, trying to find the normal life he wanted. But normal never found him. He came up the mountain in '72. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked softly. "Because your father sent you here thinking you'd fail. Thinking you'd come crawling back within the month, and he'd use your failure to take this land for his railroad." Eli's eyes found hers. "Jonah heard talk in Jackson's Crossing 3 weeks before your letter arrived. Your father's company, Whitfield Pacific Railway, is surveying the South Pass. If they route the spur line through Black Rock Canyon, it goes straight through our property." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The pieces fell into place with the cold precision of a lock clicking shut. "He sent me here as a legal weapon," she whispered. "The dowry contract he had me sign, and there's a competency clause buried in the fine print. If the marriage fails, if you're declared mentally unfit, the contract gives your father grounds to claim the land as damages." Eli's jaw tightened. "Your father didn't throw you away, Clara. He planted you, like a flag on territory he intends to conquer." The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence Clara had learned to love. It was the silence of a woman discovering that even in exile she could not escape the machinery of the man who had never wanted her. "I didn't know," Clara said. "I believe you." "What do we do?" Eli studied her for a long moment. The sunset was fading now, the gold bleeding into deep violet. The first stars were appearing over the ridgeline, cold and indifferent and eternal. "We don't let him win," Eli said. He looked at her then, really looked. Past the honey blonde hair and the blue eyes and the delicate features down to the iron core that 24 years of Whitfield cruelty had forged in her. He saw it, the thing her father never could. "Your father wrote that you were unfit for society. He meant it as an insult." Eli's voice dropped low. Quiet as snowfall, heavy as stone. "I took it as a promise." He walked away before she could respond, but the air between them had changed. The distance was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, and they were both standing at their respective ends waiting to see who would cross first. That night, for the first time since she arrived, Clara did not bolt the bunkhouse door. She was not sure what that meant, but she thought maybe he would understand. The first blizzard of the season did not creep in. It attacked. One moment the sky was a pale, cold gray, the color of old pewter. The next, the world was white. The wind came screaming through the mountain passes with a fury that shook the cabin walls, rattled the shutters, and drove snow sideways through every crack and gap in the logs. It was not weather. It was assault. the mountain throwing its weight against everything foolish enough to stand in its path. They were trapped for 3 days, all four of them. Clara, Eli, Jonah, and Levi confined to the main cabin because the bunkhouse exposed on the windward side of the ridge was buried in drift snow within the first hour. The door disappeared, then the windows. By midnight of the first day, the bunkhouse was a mound of white, indistinguishable from the landscape. Clara had never been in a space this small with three men this large. The cabin, which had seemed spacious when she arrived, contracted to the size of a prison cell. Eli alone occupied more square footage than a dining table. Jonah paced like a caged wolf. Levi, for all his gentleness, took up an enormous amount of air simply by existing. And yet, within the confinement, something unexpected emerged. Intimacy. Not the kind that makes the heart race, though, that would come later. The quieter kind. The kind that forms when four people have no choice but to exist in each other's space, to witness each other's habits, to learn the rhythms of breathing and sleeping and silence that constitute the hidden architecture of a person. Clara learned things during those 3 days that no amount of polite conversation would have revealed. She learned that Eli read by firelight every night, not dime novels or almanacs, but dense volumes of territorial law that he kept stacked under his bed. She learned that he moved through the cabin with extraordinary care, where that his size could be disruptive, placing his boots with the precision of a man who had learned to make himself small in a world that wasn't built for him. She learned that he talked in his sleep, though the words were too low and broken to understand, and that whatever he dreamed about left him sitting upright at 3 a.m, staring into the dying fire with an expression that was older than his 39 years. She learned that Jonah never fully slept. He dozed sitting up in the rocking chair, his body folded at uncomfortable angles that he seemed not to notice, one eye always half open, one hand always near his belt. He was a man who had lost everything to chaos once and had spent every day since making sure it could never happen again. Even in a cabin, surrounded by allies, Jonah Calloway kept watch. It was not paranoia, it was devotion. He watched so his brothers could rest. She learned that Levi carved at night. While the others slept, the youngest Calloway would sit by the stove with a piece of cedar and a knife turning raw wood into life. A bird, a fox, a sleeping deer. His hands, which could fell a tree in a dozen strokes, moved with a delicacy that bordered on reverence. The shavings curled at his feet like pale ribbons, and the only sound was the soft scrape of blade against grain, a whisper of creation in a world built on survival. On the second night, the cabin settled into a strange quiet. The wind still howled outside, a banshee wail that made the logs groan, but inside the fire burned steady, and the four of them had found their positions. Clara was mending a tear in Levi's coat by the firelight. Eli was cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic scrape of the oil rag the only sound beneath the storm. Jonah was at the table with his figures calculating fur prices and supply costs, the careful mathematics of staying alive another season. Levi was carving, always carving. "Why did you agree to this?" Clara asked suddenly. The question had been sitting in her chest for weeks, pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She had not planned to ask it, but the storm had stripped away the careful protocols of distance, and in the firelight, in the enforced intimacy of survival, the question simply came out. "You could have found women from the towns. Why a mail-order bride?" "Why me?" Eli set the rifle down. He did not answer immediately. It was Jonah who spoke first, his voice matter-of-fact without cruelty. "Because we needed someone who wouldn't have anywhere else to go. Women from the towns have options. They visit for a week, realize there's no society, no church, no neighbors within 20 miles, and they leave. We needed someone committed." "That's half the truth," Levi said quietly, pausing his carving. "The other half is that we watched Eli disappear for a long time after Catherine. Years where he didn't speak unless he had to. Years where the only sound in this cabin was axes and wind." He looked at Clara with those warm brown eyes. "You're the first person he's told that story to. You know that, right? In 10 years, he never spoke her name. Not to us, not to anyone, until you." The weight of that settled over Clara like snowfall. Jonah spoke next, and it surprised her because Jonah rarely offered anything that was not strategic. "I followed Eli west because he's my brother, but I stayed because this mountain doesn't lie. People lie. Contracts lie. The land tells you exactly what it is, and you either survive it or you don't. He paused, his hazel eyes catching the firelight. When your father's letter arrived, I told Eli to throw it in the fire. Another mouth to feed. Another variable I couldn't control. He looked at Clara. I was wrong. You are the least controllable thing on this mountain. And that turned out to be exactly what we needed. It was the closest thing to an apology Jonah Calloway would ever offer. Clara understood that, and she held it like something precious. Eli had been silent through his brother's confessions. Now he looked at Clara across the firelit space, and what she saw in his amber eyes was not the guarded watchfulness of their first weeks. It was something raw, something that frightened him more than any blizzard or bear or bullet. I built this cabin to need no one, Eli said. His voice was low, rough, barely above the crackle of the flames. And then you walk through that door and I realized that needing no one is not the same as being whole. Something shifted inside Clara then. Not the sudden crash of infatuation. Something slower, deeper, more dangerous. The recognition that this man saw her. Not her beauty, not her bloodline, not the seamstress's ghost that haunted her father's conscience. He saw the iron beneath the silk, and that terrified her more than the blizzard ever could. But the hardest part was still to come. The storm broke on the third morning. The silence that followed was almost more frightening than the wind. A vast crystalline stillness, as if the world had been emptied of everything but snow and sky and the sound of Clara's own breathing. Eli went out first to check the livestock shed. The horses needed water. The chickens needed feed. 3 days of storm damage needed assessment. Clara waited. 10 minutes. 20. The knot of dread that had been dormant in her stomach for 3 days pulled tight. Something's wrong, she said. Jonah was already reaching for his coat, but Clara was faster. She grabbed the heavy buffalo coat Eli had given her, snatched the shotgun from beside the door, and was outside before either brother could stop her. The world was blinding white. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the glare off the surface was like staring into the sun. Clara waded through it, her legs burning with the effort, following the trench that Eli's massive body had carved through the drifts. She found him near the woodpile, a massive pine branch, 6 feet long and as thick as a man's torso, had snapped under the weight of accumulated ice and fallen directly onto his body. He was pinned from the waist down, his face pressed into the snow unconscious. The snow around him was staining crimson, a deep spreading red that looked wrong against all that white. For exactly 2 seconds, Clara froze. The useless daughter, the seamstress's brat, the girl who was too delicate, too decorative, too nothing to matter. Every voice that had ever diminished her screamed in unison, telling her she was not enough, that she had never been enough, that this mountain had finally called the bluff that her entire life had been building toward. Then she dropped the gun. She braced her legs in the snow. She grabbed the jagged limb rough bark tearing at her palms and heaved. Her muscles screamed, her vision blurred. She remembered the engineering manuals she had read on the train. Leverage, fulcrum, the multiplication of force. She shifted her position, found a rock beneath the snow, wedged her boot against it, and heaved again. She roared. The sound ripped from her throat, raw and primal. Nothing like the carefully modulated voice she had used in the Whitfield parlor. It echoed off the granite cliffs, off the peaks, off the frozen sky. It was the sound of a woman who had spent 24 years being told she was nothing, finally discovering that she was everything. The branch lifted. 3 inches. 5. Just enough. Clara reached down with one hand, the branch balanced on her shoulder like the weight of the entire world, and grabbed Eli's coat collar. She dragged. 250 pounds of dead weight. The snow resisted sucking at his body. She dragged anyway. Jonah and Levi burst from the cabin behind her. They saw the branch, the blood, the woman with honey blonde hair and cornflower eyes heaving their brother through the snow. "Help me!" Clara screamed. Not a plea, a command. Together, the 3 of them hauled Eli inside, dragged him to the fire, stripped off his freezing clothes, and assessed the damage. His left leg was broken. The bone cracked under the weight of the pine. There was a deep gash across his ribs where a sharp branch had penetrated through the buckskin. Clara took charge. She did not ask permission. She simply did. She remembered the medical text from the train, treatment of compound fractures in frontier conditions. She ordered Levi to boil water as much as he could and to bring clean linen. She ordered Jonah to find 2 straight pieces of hardwood for a splint. She examined the leg herself, her delicate fingers probing with a clinical precision that surprised all of them. "The bone is cracked but not displaced," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I can set a splint. The wound on his ribs needs to be cleaned and packed. If infection sets in—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. She rigged a pulley system from the rafters to keep Eli's leg elevated and immobile. Using ropes from his own trapping gear, she applied the principles of tension and counterweight from a book on mining equipment. Jonah watched her work with an expression that shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. "Where did you learn this?" Jonah asked, handing her a strip of boiled linen. "Books," Clara said, wrapping the splint with quick, efficient movements. "My father never noticed what I was reading. He assumed I was looking at the pictures." For the first time, Jonah Calloway laughed, short and sharp. The laugh of a man who had just realized that the unknown variable he feared was the most valuable asset on the mountain. What followed was the longest 10 days of Clara's life. Eli's leg was stabilized, but the wound on his ribs caught infection on the second day. The fever arrived like a slow fire, turning his skin to flame and his mind to chaos. Clara did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch. She moved through the cabin with a desperate, terrifying efficiency. She boiled water endlessly, scrubbing every surface with vinegar and lye until her hands were cracked and bleeding, fighting the invisible enemy of infection with the only weapon she had: cleanliness, heat, and an iron will that had been forged in a parlor on Lindendale Boulevard and tempered on a mountain in Wyoming. Levi helped without being asked. He carried the heavy water buckets, tended the fire through the night, and sat with Eli during the rare moments when Clara allowed herself to collapse in the rocking chair. Levi's warmth sustained her. His quiet presence, his refusal to despair, his steady belief that his brother would survive because Clara would not let him die. Jonah helped in his own way, strategically. He took over all external duties alone, ran the trap lines, fed the livestock, secured the perimeter. He was a wall between the cabin and the world, ensuring that Clara could focus entirely on Eli. But Jonah also did something else, something he did not tell Clara about until much later. He rode down to Jackson's Crossing during a break in the weather and sent a telegram to a doctor in Cheyenne describing Eli's injuries and Clara's treatment. The doctor's reply, when it came, confirmed everything Clara had done was correct. Jonah kept the telegram folded in his pocket like a talisman. The hardest battles happened at night. Eli woke screaming, his mind trapped in the past. He called for Catherine. He called for names Clara did not know. Men from a war, perhaps, or ghosts from the mining town in Colorado where he had watched his wife fade away. He thrashed his massive body, threatening to reopen the wound, his hand clamping onto Clara's wrist with a grip that would leave bruises for days. "Don't leave," he rasped, his eyes open but seeing nothing. "The cold. Don't let the cold in." "I am here, Eli," Clara whispered, pressing a cool cloth to his burning forehead with one hand while gripping his hand with the other. "I am the wall against the cold. Rest." It was during those nights that Clara ceased to see herself through the mirror of society. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, she was not the seamstress's daughter. She was not the unfit girl from St. Louis. She was the lifeline. Her body, which she had spent 24 years trying to make smaller, quieter, less visible, was the only thing keeping this man alive. She had to lift him to change the linens. She had to physically restrain him when the fever dreams made him violent. A weaker woman would have broken. Clara was the mountain that met the storm. On the 11th day, the fever broke. Clara was dozing in a rocking chair, her hair matted and escaping from its pins, her dress stained with broth and blood. Dark circles under her eyes. A rasping voice woke her. "You look terrible." She jerked awake. Eli was watching her. His eyes were clear, the glassy sheen of infection gone, replaced by the piercing amber that always seemed to strip every defense she had. Clara let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "I suppose I do. But I'm alive." Eli tried to sit up, wincing. "Because of you." "Yes," she said simply. "Because of me." Eli reached out and took her hand. Not with the feverish grip of the past 10 days, but with intention. His rough thumb traced the calluses that had formed on her palm, calluses that had not been there a month ago. He studied them the way he studied tracks in the snow, reading the story they told. "They said you would break," Eli said quietly. Clara met his eyes. They were wrong about a lot of things. He did not let go of her hand. He pulled it to his chest and held it there over his heartbeat. "My wife," he said. It was not a question. It was a recognition. The bridge between them had been crossed, and there was no going back. The weeks following the fever were a season of transformation. Eli's leg healed, leaving him with a slight limp that only added to his formidable presence. But the man himself was different. He spoke more. He showed Clara the hidden places on the mountain, a waterfall that froze into a cathedral of ice, a meadow where wild horses grazed, a cave where he had found bear tracks 10 years ago and had been avoiding since. They did not kiss during this period. The tension between them was a living thing, a heat that filled the cabin whenever they occupied the same room. But Eli respected the boundary he had set on the first night, and Clara was learning to trust at a pace that her damaged heart could sustain. What they had was something rarer than passion. They had truth. Every conversation peeled back another layer, revealed another wound, and in the revealing, the healing began. The romance was witnessed and protected by Jonah and Levi, each in his own way. Levi was openly delighted. He whistled while he worked, left frozen wildflowers on Clara's pillow in the bunkhouse, and developed a habit of conveniently needing to check the horses whenever Clara and Eli found themselves alone by the fire. His happiness was infectious. His family was becoming a family again, and Levi had been waiting for this since the day his mother died. Jonah watched with the calculating eyes of a man who saw threats in every joy. He trusted Clara. She had earned that 10 times over. But he knew that happiness on the mountain was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the world below. He spent more time at the table with his maps and surveyor's figures, and Clara noticed with a chill that he was studying the railroad routes. Small acts of love replaced the words neither Clara nor Eli was ready to speak. Eli repaired Clara's saddle to fit her smaller frame without being asked. She discovered it one morning, the straps recut with the careful stitching of a leather worker. Levi left a carved wooden fox on the kitchen table where Clara always sat. Jonah one morning left a hand-drawn map of the territory on Clara's workbench, marked with water sources, sheltered passes, and the location of every cabin within 50 miles. He said nothing about it, but Clara understood. He was teaching her the land, trusting her with information that could mean the difference between life and death. One evening by the fire, Clara was repairing a hinge on the cabin door using tools from Jonah's workshop. Eli sat nearby watching. Then he reached over and placed his hand over hers, adjusting the angle of the hammer. The first deliberate touch. His hand encompassed hers completely, warmth radiating through skin. They both went still. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and in that silence something shifted between them that could never shift back. Eli withdrew his hand, stood up, walked away without a word. Clara watched him go, her heart beating harder than it had at any moment since arriving on the mountain. Jonah called a family meeting on a cold evening in late January. He spread his maps on the table, thin, precise, drawn with the hand of a trained surveyor. "There's a problem," Jonah said. His voice carried the calm, controlled tone of a man who had been carrying bad news long enough for the weight to settle into his bones. "It's worse than we thought. I rode to Jackson's Crossing 2 days ago while you were tending Eli. The railroad survey team has already driven stakes into the ground at Black Rock Canyon. They're not just planning anymore. They're building. And I found this nailed to the post office door." He placed a crumpled handbill on the table. Clara leaned forward. The text was official. Territorial Land Office. Notice of Eminent Domain Survey. Whitfield Pacific Railway. Callaway Ridge Section Township 41. "They've already filed," Clara whispered. "Which means the competency clause your father buried in the dowry contract isn't a contingency plan anymore," Jonah said. "It's a loaded gun, and he's about to pull the trigger. A mail order arrangement, and it isn't enough to fight this. Not against a man with lawyers and railroad money. The marriage needs to be legal, binding, recognized by territorial law, ironclad." Clara stood up. She looked at Eli, at Levi, at Jonah. These 3 men who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had taught her to survive, who had shown her more respect in the 2 months than her father had shown her in 24 years. "Marry me," Clara said to Eli, "properly, in front of a witness. On paper, in the eyes of Deanna and the law, she paused. But not because of my father, not because of the land. Because I choose you, Elijah Calloway. Of you, this mountain, this family, this life. I choose it. Eli crossed the room in 2 strides. He stood before Clara, towering over her, his massive frame blocking the firelight. He reached out. His rough thumb grazed her cheekbone, the gentlest touch she had ever known. They told me you were broken, Eli whispered. They lied. He leaned down. Clara rose on her toes. The last inch of distance, the last remnant of fear closed. The kiss was not hungry. It was not desperate. It tasted of coffee and cold air and homecoming. It was 2 people who had been lost in different wildernesses, finding the same path. The cabin door closed softly. The fire burned. Outside, the mountains stood in their ancient silence, and the stars came out one by one, indifferent and eternal. They married in the cabin on a Sunday morning in February with Jonah as witness and Levi reading from the family Bible. No minister. The nearest one was 60 miles away. But under territorial law, a common law marriage witnessed by 2 parties was legally binding. Clara wore the blue calico dress she had sewn from fabric Levi bought in Jackson's Crossing. Eli wore a clean shirt, the only one he owned, and had trimmed his beard to reveal the strong, handsome jaw beneath. He slipped a ring onto Clara's finger, a band he had forged himself from a silver dollar hammered and shaped at the cabin's anvil. That night, they became husband and wife in every sense. When morning came, everything had changed between them. The cabin, already warm, held a different kind of heat, the quiet, radiating warmth of 2 people who had stopped holding themselves apart. The peace lasted 2 days. On the 3rd morning after the wedding, the dogs barked, a vicious snarling sound that meant strangers. Eli grabbed his rifle. His leg was healing, but he moved with the dangerous fluidity of a man whose body remembered violence even when the mind would prefer peace. Jonah was at the window checking positions. Levi was in the bunkhouse reaching for the Winchester. 3 men on horseback, Clara reported from the spy hole in the door, heavily armed. The leader has a silver belt buckle and a red duster. Harlan Cobb, Jonah said. His voice was flat. He checked the load on his revolver without looking. Cattleman, controls the valley below us. He's been trying to buy the water rights for 5 years. He heard I was hurt, Eli said. He's coming to see if I'm dead. Eli tried to stand, but his healing leg buckled. He roared in frustration. The sound of a caged animal, the sound of a man who could not protect his own home. Clara saw the helplessness in his eyes, the fury that was worse than any wound, and she made a decision. Sit down, she said. Her voice was ice cold, not afraid, not angry, cold in the way that mountain water is cold, clear and absolute, and coming from a depth that nothing on the surface can touch. She walked to the wall and took down the double-barreled shotgun, checked the load. Buckshot. She threw the heavy buffalo coat over her shoulders. Her hands were trembling beneath it, but the coat hid the trembling, and that was enough. Clara, no! Eli's voice was raw with fear. Fear for her, not of Cobb. Cobb is a killer. So is a mother bear, Clara said. And this is my home. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She did not push it back. She stood at her full height, 5 feet 3 inches of fury and buckshot, and faced 3 armed men on horseback. The leader, Harlan Cobb, was a man who looked like he was carved from the same granite as the mountains. Hard, weathered, and utterly without mercy. He tipped his hat with a mocking courtesy that did not reach his eyes. Morning, little lady, Cobb called out. Heard the big man took a bad fall. Came to pay our respects. Maybe help with the burial. The men behind him chuckled. My husband is resting, Clara shouted. Her voice carried with an authority she had learned from 24 years of silence. All the words she never said in the Whitfield parlor saved up and released now. He has no need of your help or your burial. Cobb's eyes narrowed. He studied her. The shotgun, the set of her jaw, the cornflower eyes that held no fear, or at least none that showed. Is that so? Well, we'd like to hear that from him. Step aside, sweetheart. We're coming in. He spurred his horse forward. Clara did not flinch. She aimed at the ground in front of the horse's hooves and fired. The explosion was deafening. The snow erupted in a geyser of white. Cobb's horse reared, screaming, nearly throwing him. The other 2 horses panicked, spinning in circles. The next one takes your hat off your head, Mr. Cobb, Clara yelled, racking the next shell into the chamber. The sound of that action, the mechanical click-clack of steel against steel, was louder in the sudden silence than the shot had been. And the one after that takes your head off your shoulders. I know who you are, and I know you're trespassing on Callaway land. She paused. Then she delivered the lie. The magnificent, calculated engineer's lie. My husband rigged the bridge on the lower trail with blasting powder this autumn. You have 5 minutes to cross it before I send my brother-in-law to blow it into the gorge. There was no blasting powder. There was no rigged bridge. But Clara delivered it with such terrified conviction, her voice steady, her eyes blazing. Her body framed against the dark doorway of the cabin where 2 rifle barrels, held by Jonah and Levi, were now visible, that Cobb hesitated. He looked at the woman. He looked at the rifle barrels. He looked at his men, one of whom was already turning his horse around. Cobb spat into the snow. You're a crazy little witch. We'll be back when the snow melts. Tell the Callaways they can't hide behind a skirt forever. They're not hiding, Clara replied, her chin lifted. They're waiting. She watched them ride away, watched until they disappeared into the tree line. Only when they were gone did she lower the gun. Her knees gave way. She sank onto the porch, gasping for air, the shotgun clattering against the wood. The door opened behind her. Eli dragged himself out, leaning on the door frame. He looked at the retreating tracks, then down at his wife. This small, trembling, magnificent woman who had just faced down 3 armed men with a lie and a shotgun. Blasting powder, he asked, a grin breaking through his beard. I read about it in a mining journal. Clara managed her heart, hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. I don't actually have any. Levi burst out laughing, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the granite cliffs and startled a flock of birds from the pines. Jonah shook his head, but he was smiling. The first real smile Clara had ever seen from the middle brother. Eli slid down to sit beside her on the cold wood. He pulled her into his side, his arm heavy and warm around her shoulders. He kissed her temple, and the tenderness in it was so sharp it hurt. Remind me, Eli murmured against her hair. Never to make you angry, Mrs. Callaway. Spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent cracking of the river ice. The world transformed from white to a muddy, vibrant green. The air filled with the scent of wet earth and pine sap, and the sound of running water that had been silent beneath the ice for months. For Clara and the Callaway brothers, it was a season of building. Eli's leg healed, leaving him with a limp that only added to his menacing presence. But the man who emerged from the winter was softer in ways that surprised even himself. He laughed more. He showed Clara the hidden waterfall. He shaved his cheeks, leaving only a trimmed beard that revealed a handsome, rugged face that Clara found herself watching whenever she thought he was not looking. He was always looking. They worked the land together. They were a terrifyingly effective team. Eli knew the animals and the weather. Jonah knew the business and the strategy. Levi knew the livestock and the woodwork. And Clara knew systems. She redesigned the irrigation for their vegetable patch using hollowed logs and gravity-fed channels from the spring, doubling their yield. She built a winch system in the skinning shed that cut their work time in half. She repaired the water pump a second time, and this time Jonah did not even check her work. He simply nodded and walked away. They were happy. It was a simple, brutal, beautiful happiness. The kind that is built from shared labor and cold mornings and coffee poured without asking, and silence that is no longer uncomfortable, but is instead the language of people who have said everything important and no longer need words to say it again. But the world outside the Tetons had not forgotten Clara Whitfield. In late May, they made the journey down to Jackson's Crossing to trade their winter furs for supplies. Clara sat tall on the wagon bench, wearing the buckskin coat that fitted her form, her skin browned by the sun, her eyes bright and fierce. She did not look down when men stared. She looked them in the eye until they looked away. Eli sat beside her, one hand on the rifle, the other resting on her knee. A gesture of possession that was also a declaration. This woman is mine, and the cost of challenging that claim is higher than you can afford. The furs brought a high price. Top quality thanks to Clara's meticulous cleaning process. They bought flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, and fabric for a new dress. They were loading the wagon to leave when a man stepped out of the town's only hotel. He was out of place. A diamond in a coal bucket. He wore a gray pinstripe suit, a bowler hat, and small round spectacles. He picked his way around the horse manure with the delicate precision of a man who had never touched anything rougher than a legal brief. "Miss Whitfield," the man called out. Clara froze. She recognized the tone. Not the man himself, but the voice. It was the voice of St. Louis, the voice of drawing rooms and cruelty dressed in courtesy. "My name is Mrs. Calloway," she said, turning slowly. The man smiled, thin, oily, practiced. "Of course, my apologies. I am Percival Crane, attorney at law, representing your father, Mr. Theodore Whitfield." All three brothers moved at once. Eli stepped in front of Clara, his massive frame blocking the lawyer's view. Jonah flanked right, his hand moving to his belt. Levi moved to Clara's left, and for the first time since she had known him, the youngest Calloway was not smiling. Three walls of muscle and menace closing around her like a fortress. "What does Whitfield want?" Eli growled. "He sold her. She's gone." Crane did not back down, though his Adam's apple bobbed nervously. He produced a document from his coat. "Not quite, Mr. Calloway. When Mr. Whitfield arranged this union, he included certain stipulations in the dowry contract. Stipulations regarding the competency of the bride." He peered around Eli's shoulder at Clara. "Your father has received reports that you are living in dangerous conditions, that you were attacked by armed men, that you are, as he feared, exhibiting signs of mental instability." "He's lying," Clara said, her voice rising. "He never cared about my welfare." "The concern is legal, not sentimental," Crane admitted. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had made his peace with selling his soul and was now simply negotiating the price. "You see, Mr. Whitfield is expanding his railroad interests. The most efficient route for the new spur line passes through," he gestured vaguely toward the mountains, "Calloway Ridge." Eli went very still, the kind of still that precedes violence, the kind of still that animals recognize as the last warning before the killing strike. "The land is mine," Eli said. Each word a stone dropped into deep water. "I have the deed, Homestead Act." "Indeed, but the deed is in your name alone. And under the dowry contract you signed, which included in the fine print a provision for competency review, though, Whitfield family retains the right to petition for annulment of the marriage on grounds of the bride's incapacity. If the marriage is annulled, Mr. Whitfield claims the cost of the dowry as damages against the property." "There was no dowry," Eli snarled. "I didn't take a cent from him, man." "But you signed in the paper receiving her," Crane countered, "and in the receiving you accepted the terms." Jonah grasped the full picture first, the surveyor, the planner, the man who saw 3 moves ahead. "It's a takeover," Jonah said. His voice was quiet but lethal. "He never intended the marriage to succeed. He sent Clara as bait. When the marriage fails, he uses the contract to claim the land. And if we resist, he uses eminent domain." Crane adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Whitfield offers a choice. Mrs. Calloway can return with me to St. Louis. Her father has arranged a comfortable institution for her." He paused, letting the words settle. "A private asylum for women of delicate temperament." He turned to Eli. "In exchange, you sign over the land rights for a generous sum and go on your way." "And if we refuse?" Clara stepped around Eli, forcing herself between her husband and the man who represented every nightmare she had left behind. "Then Mr. Whitfield will use his considerable influence to have the marriage annulled on grounds of fraud. The sheriff in this territory is sympathetic to Mr. Whitfield's interests. You will be evicted, all of you, left with nothing." Eli lunged. He grabbed Crane by the lapels and lifted him off the ground. The lawyer squeaked, his feet dangling, his bowler hat tumbling into the mud. "Eli, don't," Clara shouted. "If you hurt him, they'll say you're violent. They'll use it against us." Eli held the lawyer in the air, every tendon in his neck straining with the effort of not breaking the man in half. Then, with a snarl that came from the deepest part of his chest, he dropped Crane into the mud. "Tell Whitfield," Eli said, his voice terrible in its quiet, "that if he wants my land, he can come up that mountain and take it himself. But tell him to bring more than lawyers." Crane scrambled up, wiping mud from his suit. "You are making a mistake. He will destroy you." Clara stepped forward. She was not physically large, but she radiated a presence that made the air feel thin and the ground feel unsteady. "You go back and tell my father that the daughter he threw away is dead. The woman who remains is not someone he can bully or buy or break. She held Crane's eyes until he looked away. Now get out of my sight. Crane fled, but the victory was hollow. As they rode back up the mountain, the silence between them was heavy as stone. The joy of the morning had evaporated like frost in sudden sunlight. He won't stop, Clara said quietly. My father is a machine. If he wants the land for the railroad, he will not stop until he has it. Then we break the machine, Eli said. How he has money, he has lawyers, he has the law itself. He has St. Louis, Jonah said from the wagon bed, his hazel eyes fixed on the mountain peaks rising before them. We have the high ground. And we have something he doesn't understand, Levi added softly. What? Eli took her hand. His grip was crushing and warm. We have nothing left to lose. But Clara knew that was not true. For the first time in her life, she had everything to lose. She looked at Eli, at Levi, at Jonah, at the mountain that had become her kingdom, and she knew that her father would try to take all of it. That night, Clara did not sleep. She sat by the window watching the moon cast silver light across the ridge. She opened the trunk she had brought from St. Louis. She dug past the Bible, past the wool, past the memory of her mother's hands until her fingers closed around the spine of a thick leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The numbers swam in the lamplight. Dates, sums, names, Senator Blackmore, the Platte River Bridge, consulting fees, 3 men dead. You want a war, father, she whispered, her blue eyes hardening to steel. Let's see who burns first. The plan was forged at the cabin table by firelight with the smell of pine smoke and black coffee heavy in the air. Clara laid the ledger open, her fingers trembling. Not from fear, from the magnitude of what she was about to do. She had carried this book for 6 months. She had stolen it from Theodore Whitfield's study, not as a weapon, but as insurance. A last resort. A final card to play if the Whitfield machine ever reached her in the mountains. She had hoped in the deepest and most foolish part of her heart that her father would simply forget about her, that the mountains would swallow her the way they swallowed sound, and she would disappear into a life that was harsh but free. But Theodore Whitfield did not forget. He was a machine, as she had told Eli, and machines do not forget. They process, they calculate, and they consume. This page, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand. November 1873. My father paid a bribe of $12,000 to Senator Blackmore to bypass the safety surveys for the bridge over the Platte River. The survey would have revealed that the foundation's soil was unstable. He built anyway. 3 workers died when the scaffolding collapsed during the second phase of construction. He listed the bribe as consulting fees. She flipped the page. Jonah leaned in, his hazel eyes scanning the columns with the intensity of a surveyor reading terrain. Here, he swindled the federal government out of land grants intended for Union veterans. 3 shell companies registered under the names of men who don't exist. The grants were worth $40,000 in total. He used them to acquire right-of-way for the Whitfield Pacific Line through Nebraska. She flipped again. And here, the miners' strike of 1874 at the Copper Hill Shaft. He hired Pinkerton agents to break the strike. 2 miners were beaten to death. He paid the Pinkertons through a subsidiary and then claimed the subsidiary was independent. Clara closed the ledger and looked at the 3 brothers. If this reaches the United States Marshals, if the territorial governor sees this, the railroad stops. My father's government contracts are voided. He faces federal indictment on fraud and bribery charges. And his claim on this land dissolves because a man under federal investigation cannot invoke eminent domain. Eli studied the ledger. Then he studied his wife. His expression was a landscape of conflicting emotions, admiration, concern, and something that might have been fear. Not fear of the plan, fear of what it would cost her. If you do this, Eli said slowly, your father goes to prison. His name is destroyed. You can never go back to that world. Clara met his eyes. I never belonged to that world, Eli. I was just trapped in it. She's right, Jonah said. His voice had the crisp edge of a man who had shifted from analysis to action. But timing is critical. The telegraph in Jackson's Crossing isn't secure. Crane owns the operator. If we send this by wire, it gets intercepted. Cheyenne is a 3-day ride, Levi said, leaning against the cabin wall. His arms crossed, his gentle face drawn tight with worry. And Cobb's men are watching the trails. They've been circling since the thaw. It has to go by hand, Clara said. Someone has to ride to Cheyenne and deliver the evidence directly to the marshal's office. The silence in the cabin was thick as wool. They all knew what this meant. Someone leaves, someone stays. And whoever stays has to face Harlan Cobb's mercenaries without full strength. Eli stood. His limp was barely noticeable now. His body had reknit itself with the stubborn resilience of a man who refuses to be diminished. I'll ride. I know the territory better than anyone. No. Clara's voice was flat, final. You're the one they're afraid of. If you leave, Cobb attacks within hours. You have to be here. You and Jonah and Levi. 3 men defending one position. And you ride to Cheyenne alone. Eli's jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables. Through Cobb's territory, past men who would kill you for the horse, let alone what you're carrying. I'm small, I'm fast, and no one is looking for a woman on the trail. They're looking for a Calloway. Clara's voice did not waver. I can take the mountain path above the tree line, the one you showed me in March. Eli shook his head. The refusal was instinctive, the protective fury of a man who would rather face 100 guns than let the woman he loved ride into danger. But Jonah spoke. She's right, Eli. Jonah's voice was quiet, measured, carrying the weight of a truth that no one wanted to hear. It has to be Clara. She knows the evidence. She can explain it to the marshals in legal terms. She's the only one of us who speaks their language. And she's the one they'll believe. A woman fleeing a corrupt father carrying proof of his crimes. Eli turned to Jonah. The look that passed between them was the look of brothers who had carried each other through a decade of wilderness. Wordless, absolute, heartbreaking. Eli knew Jonah was right. He hated it with every fiber of his being. But he knew. Levi stepped forward. He pulled something from his pocket. The carved wooden bird, the first piece Clara had seen on the mantel the day she arrived. He pressed it into her palm. For luck, Levi said. His warm brown eyes were bright with the effort of not breaking. Bring it back. Bring yourself back. Clara wrapped her fingers around the small carving. The wood was smooth and warm, polished by years of Levi's hands. She tucked it into the pocket of her coat over her heart. They spent the night preparing. Eli moved through the forest like a ghost, setting snares not for rabbits but for horses. He dug shallow pits and covered them with pine boughs. He positioned fallen logs across the narrowest points of the trail, creating natural choke points where 3 men with rifles could hold off a dozen. He turned the approach to the cabin into a gauntlet. Jonah inventoried the ammunition: 3 rifles, 2 revolvers, 400 rounds, enough for a siege, not for a prolonged war. He mapped the firing positions, the granite outcropping 300 yards to the north for Eli, the cabin windows for himself, the bunkhouse roof for Levi. Each brother assigned a field of fire, each angle covered. Levi selected the fastest horse, a gray mare named Smoke, small, sure-footed, and blessed with the temperament of a creature that did not panic when the world was exploding. He saddled her with a light rig, packed the saddlebags with water jerky and ammunition, and tied the oilcloth-wrapped ledger beneath the saddle blanket where it would not shift. At dawn, the mist clung to the peaks like a shroud. The air smelled of pine and frost and goodbye, though none of them used that word. Calloway men did not say goodbye. They said what mattered. Eli lifted Clara onto the saddle. He reached up, grabbed the back of her neck, and pulled her down. The kiss was fierce and full of everything that words could not hold. The taste of coffee and cold air and a man who had found the thing he was afraid to want. Ride hard, he whispered against her lips. Don't look back. Even if you hear shooting, don't look back. I'll bring the law, Clara vowed. Her voice cracked, the first time it had cracked since she arrived on the mountain. Stay alive, Elijah Calloway. You promised me a lifetime. Do not cheat me on the bargain. She pulled away, snapped the reins. The gray mare lunged forward. Clara Calloway rode to war. She had not been gone an hour when the first shot rang out. It cracked through the morning silence like a bone breaking, echoing up the canyon and through the passes. Clara heard it, felt it. In the pit of her stomach, a cold fist closing. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around. Don't look back. She forced the mare into a gallop, hoofbeats swallowed by the forest floor, and rode north along the mountain path above the tree line. The trail was barely wide enough for a horse. On one side, the granite wall of the mountain. On the other, a drop that did not end. 300 feet of empty air and jagged rock. Clara leaned into the mare's neck and rode. Back at the ridge, the battle began. Harlan Cobb had not come with 3 men this time. He had come with 12. Hard cases, mercenaries, ex-soldiers and drifters paid with Whitfield money funneled through Percival Crane. They rode up the main trail in a column confident in their numbers, expecting to find a wounded man, his brothers, and an empty cabin. They did not expect what they found. The lead rider's horse stepped on the first trap, a concealed pit covered with pine boughs. The horse screamed, its forelegs snapping, and the rider was thrown into the snow. The column scattered. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Eli was prone on the granite outcropping, his body covered in moss and dirt, invisible against the stone. Through the rifle scope, he saw them. 12 men, hired killers every one. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The lead rider's hat flew off his head. The second shot shattered a canteen hanging from a saddle. The third dropped the horse of a man trying to flank the cabin from the east. He did not try to kill them. He tried to terrify them. A dead man is a problem that gets buried. A terrified man is a problem that runs home and tells everyone he knows not to come back. Jonah fired from the cabin window covering the southern approach. Each shot was surgical, precise. The shots of a man who had learned to shoot the same way he had learned to survey land, measuring angles, calculating drop, every bullet accounted for. Levi was on the bunkhouse roof, the most exposed position. He lay flat on tar paper while bullets chewed the wood around him, sending splinters into the air like wooden snow. He was the least skilled marksman of the 3 brothers, but his willingness to hold that position to absorb the danger, so his brothers could focus, was a testament to the quiet courage that had always defined the youngest Calloway. The quiet one did not need to be loud. He needed to be there. And he was. For 2 days the siege raged, a game of cat and mouse played in blood and patience. Cobb's mercenaries had numbers, but the Calloways had position knowledge of the terrain and the particular ferocity of men defending their home. By the evening of the first day, Cobb had lost 2 horses and 1 man hit in the shoulder by Jonah and dragged away by his companions. He had pushed the Calloways back to the cabin perimeter, burning the livestock shed in the workshop. The smoke was thick and choking black columns rising against the blue sky like signals to a god who was not answering. On the second day, Cobb's men brought fire. Flaming arrows, crude but effective, arcing through the cold air like dying stars. They set the bunkhouse roof ablaze. Levi dropped from the burning structure, rolled in the snow to extinguish the embers on his coat, and took position in the cellar beneath the main cabin, firing through the narrow ventilation slits. By the second evening, the brothers were running low on everything: ammunition, water, hope. Eli had a bullet graze along his ribs, a line of fire that bled steadily, but was not life-threatening if he kept pressure on it. Jonah had taken a wood splinter to the forearm from a bullet that shattered the window frame. Levi was unhurt but exhausted. His gentle face hardened into something that looked like granite. The main cabin's porch was burning. The flames licked up the walls, the logs blackening and cracking, the heat driving them back from the windows. Smoke filled the interior, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. "Come on out, Calloways," Cobb screamed from behind a boulder. "I know the woman is gone. We saw the tracks. Give up the deed and you walk away." Eli sat inside the cabin, his back against the heavy logs. He had 3 bullets left. Jonah had 2. Levi had 1. Eli looked at the empty bed where Clara slept. He looked at the carved animals on the mantel. The bird was missing, carried away in Clara's pocket. He looked at the silver ring on his left hand, the twin of the one on Clara's finger. "Think she made it?" Levi asked. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who had accepted what was coming and wanted to spend his last minutes talking about something that mattered. "She made it," Eli said. He did not explain how he knew. He simply knew the way he knew when the weather was turning or when the mountain was about to shed its snow. Clara made it because Clara did not fail. Not anymore. "Then we hold," Jonah said. He checked his revolver, snapped the cylinder shut. "Harder things have been survived." "A man keeps his word," Eli said. They nodded. All 3, at the same time, they readied themselves to die on their feet. Clara did not go to Cheyenne. 10 miles down the mountain path clear of Cobb's territory, She reined in the gray mare and made a calculation. The kind of calculation her engineering manuals had taught her. Cold, precise, ruthless in its logic. Cheyenne was 3 days away. 3 days of riding through open territory. 3 days of exposure. 3 days during which Eli, Jonah, and Levi were fighting a war they could not win. She had heard the first shot an hour after she left. She had heard scattered gunfire since. Distant pops that could have been firecrackers if she did not know better. 3 days was too long. She pulled the map from her saddlebag. The map Jonah had drawn with a surveyor's precision, marking every settlement, every trail, every resource within 100 miles. Her eyes found it. Granite Creek, a mining spur. 12 miles south. There was a telegraph there for company use only, and, more importantly, there was a locomotive. Clara turned the mare south. The road to Granite Creek was not a road. It was a mining track wide enough for ore wagons but riddled with frozen ruts and boulders. The gray mare picked her way through with the steady confidence of an animal bred for mountain terrain. Clara bent low over the horse's neck, feeling the power of the animal beneath her, and thought about her mother. Lenore, the seamstress, the woman who mended shirts for pennies. She had taught Clara a lesson that Theodore Whitfield never understood. You do not need power to change the world. You need the right thread, the right needle, and the patience to stitch until the work is done. Clara was stitching now, stitching with hoofbeats and Morse code and whatever thread she could find. She arrived at Granite Creek at sunset. The mining camp was a rough collection of shacks, ore carts, and a single narrow-gauge track that ran down the valley to connect with the main line. The telegraph was in the foreman's office, a tar-papered shack at the end of the spur. The locomotive sat on the tracks nearby. A switching engine, squat and ugly and powerful, built to pull heavy loads up steep grades. Its smokestack was breathing thin, gray smoke. Someone had kept the boiler warm. Clara did not walk into the foreman's office asking for a favor. She walked in with the double-barreled shotgun leveled at his chest. Kalen, the foreman, was a thick-necked man with soot-stained skin and the permanently irritated expression of a man who had been cheated by life. He looked at this small, dust-covered woman with the wild blue eyes and the gun that was too big for her hands, and he laughed. "Now what do we have here, a lost little?" Clara fired one barrel into the ceiling. The explosion was deafening in the small shack. Plaster rained down like snow. Kalen dove under his desk. When he came back up, his face was the color of old milk. "I am Mrs. Elijah Calloway," Clara announced. Her voice carried the steel that Theodore Whitfield had been forging in her for 24 years of insults and dismissals and locked doors steel that was finally being put to a purpose worthy of its making. "And you will open this telegraph line to the United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne, so now. Lady, I can't just... My father made me learn Morse code when I was 12 years old," Clara said, racking the second shell. "He wanted me to take dictation for his telegraph correspondence. He never imagined I would use the skill to destroy him." She stepped closer. "I can operate this machine myself. The question is whether you want to help me or whether you want me to send the wire standing over your body. Do not test me." Kalen sat at the key. His hand shook. "What do you want me to send?" Clara slapped the ledger onto the desk. She opened it to the page she had marked with a ribbon. She read the entries aloud. Dates, names, amounts. Her voice was steady, precise, as if she were reading from a textbook and not the document that would bury her own father. She made him send it 3 times. Then she made him wait for the acknowledgement. The ticker clattered back. "Received. Marshals dispatched via rail from Cheyenne. Hold fast. Estimated arrival 14 hours. 14 hours. Clara looked out the window. She counted in her head. If Cobb attacked at dawn, the brothers had been fighting for nearly 12 hours by now. 14 more hours meant tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning might be too late. She looked at the locomotive on the tracks. 50 tons of iron and steam. "Can you drive that engine?" she asked. Kalen blinked. "Yes, but the tracks end at the spur head, 3 miles from your ridge. After that, there's nothing but forest." Clara looked at the locomotive. She looked at the forest. She did the calculation. Weight of the engine, gradient of the slope, density of the pine stands between the spur head and the ridge. She remembered the chapter on inertia, the chapter on emergency braking, the chapter on what happens when a locomotive leaves the rails. "Then we'll make our own road," she said. On the ridge, the end was near. Cobb's men had set fire to the front wall of the cabin. The flames were climbing the logs, the heat intense enough to blister skin. Smoke poured through every crack and seam. The cabin that Eli had built with his own hands 9 years ago, the first thing he had created after the last thing he had lost, was dying around him. The three brothers retreated to the cellar, the stone-walled root cellar beneath the cabin floor. Their last defensible position. The air was thick with smoke seeping through the floorboards above them. Orange light flickered through the cracks like the glow of a furnace. Eli had 3 bullets. Jonah had 2. Levi had 1. They sat in the dim cellar. 3 men battered and bleeding and burned in a hole in the ground with the world falling in on top of them. "Come on out, Callaways," Cobb's voice ragged with frustration and smoke. "The cabin's coming down. You've got 1 minute before the whole thing falls on your heads." Eli looked at his brothers. They looked back at him. Jonah's face was blackened with soot, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his hazel eyes still sharp, still calculating, still looking for the angle, even when there were no angles left. Levi, tall and gentle and indestructible, met Eli's gaze with the steady warmth that had sustained this family through every loss, every storm, every long winter night. When the silence was loud enough to crush a man's soul, they readied themselves to die on their feet, and then the ground shook. Not an earthquake, something rhythmic, mechanical. A vibration that grew louder and louder, resonating through the stone walls of the cellar, through the bedrock of the mountain itself. Then the sound, the impossible world-shattering sound of a steam whistle screaming through the valley. Closer than any train had ever been to this ridge, closer than any train should be. Above ground, Cobb's men turned. The whistle shrieked again, a banshee wail that echoed off the granite cliffs and filled the valley with a sound like the voice of God having a very bad day. Through the tree line, impossible, absurd, magnificent, a locomotive exploded out of the forest. It was off the tracks, plowing through the soft earth of the valley floor, its wheels churning up dirt and pine needles, its cowcatcher smashing through saplings and brush. Smoke and steam billowed from its stack. Its headlamp cut through the evening gloom like a single enormous eye. At the throttle, visible through the cab window, was a woman, small, blonde, eyes like the center of a blue flame. She had the throttle wide open and she was screaming something that was lost in the cacophony of shrieking metal and exploding wood. The locomotive did not reach the ridge. The terrain defeated it. A quarter-mile from the cabin, the wheels grinding to a halt in soft ground, the engine canting to one side with a groan of tortured metal. But the diversion was absolute. Cobb's men, scattered horses, bolting the disciplined siege, dissolved into chaos by the sight of a train that had no earthly business being in the middle of a mountain forest. And in the confusion pouring over the hill from the opposite direction came a column of riders. United States Marshals dispatched from Jackson's Crossing after receiving the wire from Granite Creek. They had been riding through the night following the smoke, and the locomotive's whistle had guided them the last mile like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. "Federal Marshals," a voice boomed across the valley. "Drop your weapons, all of you, on the ground, now." Cobb looked at the burning cabin. He looked at the marshals. He looked at the smoking, hissing locomotive, half buried in the mountainside, and at the woman climbing down from the cab with a shotgun in one hand and a leather-bound ledger in the other. He dropped his gun. Clara did not wait for the marshals to secure the prisoners. She ran. Scrambled up the slope, ignoring the heat from the burning cabin, ignoring the embers that stung her skin, ignoring everything except the cellar doors. She tore them open. Eli, Jonah, Levi. For one heartbeat, one endless, terrible heartbeat, there was silence. Then a soot-covered hand reached up from the darkness. Eli climbed out, coughing, his eyebrows singed off his shirt, soaked with blood. Behind him, Jonah emerged, face blackened, arm bandaged. And finally, Levi, tall and gentle and somehow still standing, pulled himself out of the cellar, looked at the smoking locomotive in the trees and started to laugh. Eli fell to his knees, not from weakness, from something else, something that did not have a name in the rough vocabulary of mountain men. Clara dropped beside him, wrapping her arms around his massive shoulders, burying her face in the crook of his neck. They stayed there, in the dirt, in the ash, while the marshals arrested Cobb's men, while the fire slowly died, while the locomotive hissed its last breath of steam into the evening air. Two people kneeling in the ruins of everything they had built, holding on to the one thing that could not be burned. "You crashed a train," Eli rasped, his voice destroyed by smoke. "I told you," Clara whispered, holding him tighter. "I am not a delicate flower." Jonah limped over. He looked down at them with the expression of a man who had spent his entire life calculating probabilities and had just witnessed something that broke every model he had ever built. "Remind me," Jonah said, his voice hoarse but carrying the ghost of a smile, "never to underestimate a Whitfield." "Calloway," Clara corrected him without looking up. Levi dropped to his knees beside them and wrapped his long arms around all three. Eli, Clara, and Jonah pulled into a single embrace. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The carved bird in Clara's pocket pressed against her ribs, and she knew with the certainty of a woman who had finally stopped running that she was home. "This is where we belong," Levi whispered. "All of us." The days after the battle were quiet in the way that follows catastrophe. The cabin was gone, but the cellar was intact. The stone foundation was solid, and the granite fireplace stood in the middle of the ashes like a monument, its mantle cracked and blackened, but unbroken. On the mantle, singed but whole, were Levi's carvings. The fox, the bear, the sleeping deer, the mountain cat. The stone had protected them. Stone does not burn. "We build again," Clara said, standing in the ashes beside Eli on the second morning. Eli looked at her, at the ruins, at the mountains. "We build again," he said. Jonah had already begun sketching plans before the coals were cold. 2 stories this time, 4 bedrooms. "For the future," he said, and Clara understood what he meant. The United States Marshals spent 2 weeks collecting testimony. Clara sat before 2 federal officers and presented the evidence from Theodore Whitfield's ledger with the clarity and logic of a trained prosecutor. Both marshals looked at each other, then looked at Eli with an expression that said volumes about what they thought of a man lucky enough to marry this woman. Eli stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed. When the marshal asked if he had anything to add, he said, "She has said everything that needs to be said. I will add only this. Anyone who calls this woman insane is the one who needs examining." The federal investigation into Theodore Whitfield's affairs took 14 months. The ledger Clara provided was a roadmap to corruption that the newspapers called the Whitfield Rot. Senator Blackmore was removed from office. 3 railroad executives were indicted as co-conspirators. The Whitfield Pacific Railway was placed into receivership, its government contracts voided. Theodore Whitfield was indicted on 32 counts of fraud, bribery, and criminal negligence resulting in wrongful death. He never saw the inside of a courtroom. The morning his trial was scheduled to begin, he suffered a massive stroke in the dining room of the Whitfield Mansion on Lindell Boulevard. The same dining room where he had told Clara she was being sent to men who needed a servant, not a wife. He died 3 days later, penniless, disgraced, abandoned by the society he had worshipped. Clara received a letter from Margaret, the last letter she would ever receive from St. Louis. It was short. "Father collapsed, morning of the trial, in the dining room. He died 3 days later. No one came to the funeral except family. Lucille is selling the house. We are going to Virginia. Don't write back." Clara read the letter once, folded it, placed it in a drawer. She did not cry. She had cried for Theodore Whitfield long ago, when she was 6 years old and her mother was dying and her father did not come to the bedside. There was nothing left to cry for now. Eli found the letter a week later when he was cleaning. He read it, looked at Clara, and said the only thing that needed to be said. "Your father is gone. You are not." Percival Crane was disbarred and sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison. Harlan Cobb received 15 years for arson, assault, and conspiracy. His cattle empire was dissolved, the water rights returned to the public trust. The railroad was rerouted through the valley floor 20 miles south of Calloway Ridge on land that no one had to die to protect. 6 months after the battle, when the new cabin was standing and the scent of fresh-cut timber had replaced the smell of ash, a traveling minister came to Calloway Ridge. Reverend Ashford, a weathered man of God who rode a circuit through the mountain settlements. It was his first visit to the ridge in 10 years. This wedding was not the hasty legal arrangement of February. This was a commitment before God. Clara wore white, a dress Eli had ordered from Cheyenne, the first dress in her entire life that had been purchased new for her and for no one else. Eli wore a clean shirt. He had shaved carefully, leaving the trim beard that Clara loved. Levi served as best man. Jonah stood in the aisle, arms crossed, eyes suspiciously bright, with something he would deny to his dying day. Eli spoke his vows, not from a book, his own words in his own voice, the deep, unused rumble that had learned to speak again, because this woman had given him reason. I promise I will never let you be cold, never let you be hungry, never let you forget that you were chosen, not out of duty, but because you are the most beautiful thing God ever carved. Clara spoke hers. I promise I will never stop fighting for this family, never stop building, never forget that this mountain gave me everything the old world refused. Reverend Ashford pronounced them husband and wife. Eli carved their initials into the new cabin door frame with the knife he used for woodwork. EC plus CC, 1879, the year they first married. Because some things you carry forward no matter how many times the fire comes. The door closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything had changed. And now the years. This is the part of the story that matters most, not the gunfire, not the locomotive, not the courtroom or the collapse of an empire. Those are the events. What follows is the life, and the life is what endures. The first spring together, 1879. Clara and Eli planted a garden. She designed an irrigation system using hollowed logs fed by the natural spring, carrying water downhill through channels she carved herself. The vegetable patch produced enough for 4 people with surplus to sell at Jackson's Crossing. Levi planted climbing ivy along the eastern wall of the new cabin because Clara had mentioned once that she used to look at the gardens in St. Louis through the iron fence but was never allowed to enter them. She had her own garden now, and there was no fence. The hard winter of 1880. The worst blizzard in a decade. They lost 3 chickens. Levi mourned each one by name. Duchess, General, Trouble. But the supply system that Clara had designed kept them safe. 6 months of food calculated and stored. Wood stacked by the method she had learned from her engineering techs. A ventilation system in the root cellar that prevented the damp and mold that destroyed provisions in most frontier homesteads. For the first time, winter was not a battle for survival. It was a season of rest. Summer of 1881. A son was born. Wyatt Elijah Calloway. Clara chose the name Wyatt from the stories Levi told by the fire tales of lawmen and frontier justice. The middle name was his father's because some things deserve to be passed down. Clara gave birth in the cabin, Eli beside her. His hands, which could chop wood all day without trembling, shook as he held the baby. 7 pounds of new life with Clara's blue eyes and Eli's untamable spirit. Levi carved a fawn for the mantle. Jonah wrote the baby's name in the family ledger in his precise surveyor's hand, and if his writing was a little unsteady, no one mentioned it. Eli held his son and looked down at the small face and whispered something that was not meant for the baby. It was meant for Catherine, for the past, for the version of himself who had once brought someone to a place she could not survive. I won't make the same mistake this time. This time I brought the right person. The ranch expanded 1882 through 1885. They raised horses now, sturdy mountain ponies bred for the terrain. The fur trade was supplemented by timber and vegetables. Jonah handled the business side with the precision of a man who had found his calling in ledgers and supply chains instead of surveyor's maps. Levi handled the livestock with a gentleness that even wild horses respected. New neighbors arrived. The Fletcher family settled 10 miles south. The first people to visit Calloway Ridge out of friendship rather than threat. Clara taught the Fletcher daughter to read. Eli helped Fletcher build his barn. For the first time in a decade, there was laughter in the valley that did not come from a Calloway. The year of loss, 1886. A hard winter. A failed crop. And Smoke, the gray mare who had carried Clara on the ride that saved their lives, died of old age. Clara buried her on the hilltop overlooking the valley. Eli stood beside her, saying nothing, one hand on her shoulder. Levi placed a freshly carved bird on the grave. That was how the Calloways mourned, with presence, not words. Winter always ends, Eli said when Clara finally stood up from the grave. Jonah married in 1887. Her name was Wren Fletcher, the neighbor's daughter who had grown up reading the books Clara lent her. The wild one found his harbor. Wren taught Jonah something that his brothers in the mountain never could, that controlling everything is not strength. That sometimes letting Things Happen is the bravest thing a man can do. Levi and the Violin. 1889. Levi bought a violin in Cheyenne. He could not play it. The sounds he produced were closer to a cat caught in a gate than to music. But every evening he sat by the fire and drew the bow across the strings slowly, carefully, with the concentration of a wood carver seeking the shape hidden inside the block. Wyatt, 8 years old, sat at Levi's feet and listened without laughing. The child understood what adults sometimes forget, that the value of music is not in perfection, but in the trying. Those evenings, Levi's off-key violin, Wyatt's laughter as he ran between the table legs, Eli reading beside Clara, her head on his shoulder, Jonah and Wren whispering in the corner. Those were the evenings when Clara knew she was wealthy, not with Whitfield money, with something Whitfield money could never buy, the school on the mountain, 1890. When Wyatt reached school age, there was no school within 50 miles. Clara, the seamstress's daughter, the girl who stole books from her father's study, became the teacher. She taught Wyatt to read and write using engineering manuals and medical texts because there were no textbooks on the mountain. By the time he was 10, the boy could calculate the cross-sectional area of a log and explain how to treat a compound fracture. Not typical knowledge for a frontier child, but the kind of knowledge that saves lives. When the Fletcher children came to learn too, Clara had 3 students teaching them at the kitchen table, writing with charcoal on flat wood because there was no blackboard. Eli watched his wife teach. The woman her father had called unfit for society, building the future for the next generation. And he knew that this was the kind of wealth that Theodore Whitfield, with all his railroads and mansions, could never touch. Knowledge is the only inheritance no one can take from you, Clara told Wyatt when he asked why she made him read so many books. Old Walt's Last Winter, 1892. The toothless old man who had driven Clara up the mountain 14 years earlier died in his sleep. He passed, sitting in his chair outside his small cabin in Jackson's Crossing, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the snow. When Clara heard, she sat on the porch alone for a long time. Walt had been the first person outside the Calloway family to speak to her when she arrived in Wyoming. "Hope you're tougher than you look." And now he was gone. Eli found her there, not crying but silent, in the way he recognized as grief. He sat down beside her, said nothing, put his hand over hers. They sat there until the sun went down, and the silence said more than any words could have. "Winter always ends," he said when she finally stood. The Next Generation, 1895 through 1900. Wyatt grew into a young man with his mother's eyes and his father's backbone. He learned to ride from Levi, to read maps from Jonah, to keep his word from Eli. At 18, he asked to go to Cheyenne to study veterinary medicine, not to leave the mountain, but to bring knowledge back for the ranch livestock. Clara packed his trunk the same way she had packed her own 17 years earlier, but this time the trunk held new books, not stolen ones. And this time the woman doing the packing was not a girl being discarded. She was a mother full of pride. Eli stood by the wagon watching his son prepare to leave and said the thing his own father never said to him. "You always have a home to come back to. This is where you belong," Levi added, his voice rough. "Always." 25 years. That is how much time had passed since the girl in the navy blue dress stepped off a mule cart into nothing. It was September 1904. The cabin had been rebuilt twice and was now a 2-story house with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a wraparound porch that faced the sunset. The fire scars were hidden beneath fresh timber and the climbing ivy that Levi had planted. Eli was 64 years old. His beard was silver, the limp was more pronounced on damp days, but his amber eyes were as sharp as the day Clara first saw them through the gloom of a cabin doorway. He still chopped wood every morning, though Wyatt, now 23, grabbed the axe before his father could reach it. Sometimes early in the morning before dawn, Clara watched from the kitchen window as Eli stood on the porch with his coffee, looking out at the Tetons, the same mountains he had been looking at for over 30 years. But now he looked at them with a contentment that the young man fleeing Philadelphia could never have imagined. Clara was 49. There was silver in the honey blonde hair. Her hands were still calloused, her skin still sun-browned. She no longer looked like the girl who stepped off the mule cart, but she did not look like the woman Theodore Whitfield had wanted her to become either. She looked like the mountain, weathered, strong, unbreakable. Jonah lived in the smaller cabin with Ren and their 3 children. He was still sharp, still dangerous when he needed to be, still the first to see a threat, but the scar on his jaw was hidden now beneath a silver beard, and the hands that once held a knife now held his youngest daughter's hand as he taught her to walk. When people asked about the scar, he no longer told the story of the knife fight in Deadwood. He simply said, "Oh, old scar, doesn't matter." And to him, it truly did not matter anymore. Levi was 60 years old and still the tallest man on the mountain. He had never married. When people asked why, he smiled the smile that could melt ice and said, "I already have a family." He was Uncle Levi to every Calloway child. The storyteller by the fire. The carver of wooden toys for every baby born on the ridge. His carvings sold throughout Wyoming territory. People came to Jackson's Crossing just to buy them. But the first bird, the one Clara had carried in her coat pocket the day she crashed a locomotive into a forest, still sat on the mantel of the new cabin, glossy from 25 years of hands touching it for luck. In the evenings, Levi still played the violin, still off-key, still beautiful. And on the doorframe of the cabin, the new doorframe built of oak stronger than the old pine carved in the same place in the same size were the initials, EC plus CC, 1879. Eli had carved them again into the new wood, because there are things you do not let the fire take. "Stronger together than apart," Levi said every evening when the family gathered. It was the phrase he had been saying for 25 years, and it had never once stopped being true. On a warm September afternoon, Clara stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her denim apron, watching the path that wound up from the valley. 3 figures were coming home. Eli led, walking with his slight limp, on his shoulders a toddler. Wyatt's daughter, 2 years old with tiny fists tangled in her grandfather's silver hair, laughing the pure, uncomplicated laugh of a child who has never known a world without love. Behind Eli walked Levi, leading 2 new horses from the valley market, 60 years old and still moving with the gentle deliberateness that had always made him seem less like a giant and more like a guardian. And behind Levi, Wyatt, walking beside his father, his young hands already bearing the calluses that marked a Calloway man. Today there was a visitor, a rare event. A journalist from a Denver newspaper had ridden up, drawn by the legend that the frontier papers called the Iron Bride of the Tetons. The woman who crashed a locomotive, brought down a railroad empire, and turned a mountain fortress into a kingdom. The journalist, a young man named Finch, stood nervously by the gate. He looked at Clara, at her height, at her bright, fierce eyes, at the quiet authority that radiated from her like heat from the stove. He swallowed hard. "Mrs. Calloway," Finch said, pulling out his notebook, "I'm writing about the frontier, about hardship and survival. They tell a story back east. Pardon my bluntness, but they say you were sent here as a punishment, that your father considered you unfit for society and shipped you to the wilderness to be rid of you." Clara looked at Eli. He had set the toddler down and was walking toward her, his arms settling around her waist, with the easy possessiveness of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. She looked at Levi, showing the granddaughter how to stroke the nose of the new horse, his massive hands gentle as prayer. She looked at Jonah stepping out from his cabin, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the journalist with a look that dared the young man to write a single dishonest word. 25 years had not dulled the edge of the wild one. They had simply taught him when to sharpen it. "Punishment," Eli rumbled, and in the word there was a warning. Clara smiled. It was the smile that transformed everything. The cornflower eyes, the delicate features, the quiet face that 24 years of Whitfield cruelty could not break. It was a smile of absolute, unshakable triumph. "You can tell them," Clara said, her voice clear as mountain water, "that my father did not send me to a punishment. He sent me to a kingdom." She rested her head against Eli's chest, listening to the steady drumbeat of his heart. The heart she saved, the heart that saved her back. "And you can tell them," she added, her blue eyes bright with the light of the Teton sunset, "that the beast didn't need a beauty. He needed a queen." The journalist scribbled furiously, sensing the end of the story, but Clara and Eli and Jonah and Levi had already stopped paying attention to him. They turned back to the cabin, to the children, to the horses, and to the mountains that had claimed them all. She still remembered stepping off that mule cart into nothing. 25 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchild chase wildflowers through the meadow, She thought that was the day my life began. The mountain did not care, but the men on it and the woman who had learned to belong, they cared, and that was all that was needed. Built this with our own hands, Levi said softly, looking out at the land they had fought for, bled for, nearly died for. Clara reached for Eli's hand. His grip was the same as always. Rough, warm, certain. This is where we belong, she said. And the mountains stood in their ancient silence, and the sun went down behind the Tetons, and the light turned gold, then amber, then the deep, perfect blue of a Wyoming evening. And on the porch, four people who had found each other in the wilderness sat together and watched the stars come out one by one, the way they always had, the way they always would.